Hi, my name is Jim Cutler, and I live in Ashfield, Massachusetts, which is located in what we call the Hill Towns. This is a hilly area, what one might refer to as the foothills of the Berkshires, just west of I-91. And it's an area which is very close to the Pioneer Valley and the Five College area. So we have a lot of folks here who over the years have migrated and moved up here after graduating from the universities down in the valley. So it's a very unique environment, and it's a very unique community. So I moved here about 4 years ago as someone who was familiar with this area, having lived here back in the 70s when I had first moved away from home. And I moved out here. I came out here to visit my sister who was going to UMass, and I was with my brother. And we happened upon one of the first demonstrations to block the containment vessel which was being shipped by rail up to Seabrook, New Hampshire. And I remember turning to him and saying that, you know, I've kind of found my people and I'm going to stay here. I'll bring you back home to Boston, but I'm coming back to live here because this is where I belong. And I stayed out here for a few years, bought my first home, had my first child in that home, and but then moved back to Boston to be near family and to get my certification in solar engineering, which is what I did. So it was a good reason to go back to the city. And but subsequently, over the years, I went into computers because the Reagan administration had undone all of the solar tax credits that Jimmy Carter had put into place, and that basically eviscerated the solar industry at that time in the 80s. So my career ended and I went into computers at that point. About 5 or 6 years ago, I decided that I needed to move back here because I just felt out of place. The Boston area just wasn't Western Mass, and I really felt I needed to go back out and to continue living my life out here. And so I did that. And then about 4 years ago, I finally found this location to live. I wanted to build, but that turned out not to be possible because of you know, the housing, and I felt it wasn't right to build yet another house when we have such an overabundance of housing that is not doing well in the market. So I found this place, or I should say this place found me, and I'm here because property and place is very important to me. I had a very tumultuous childhood. I've been to 11 different schools. My father died when I was young, and my mother was hospitalized for about 6 years. So I was kind of an orphan for a while. So place became very important to me. And when I came out here and I looked at this property, I really felt that I was where I needed to be. I was home. And so I bought it, and I have purchased it for myself, but also for my family. I have 3 boys, and I consider this a very important legacy property that I will be handing down to them. So what happens here is extremely important. And there's a beautiful, very large, old-growth pine tree out in the back part of the property. It's about 36 acres, and it borders on the Bear River, one of the most pristine cold water fisheries in the state, if you talk to anybody who knows something about fishing. That particular tree is an absolutely gorgeous specimen, and I decided with my boys to spread my mother's ashes around that tree. So it's a very sacred tree in a very sacred place on the property. And so here now I was in what I considered to be my final residence, and I would tell people that I will not be moving again. This is where I will be through the end of my days. And then last March, I was speaking with some neighbors down the road who were telling me that somebody's knocking on their doors and leaving leaflets about wanting to survey their property. And I said, well, what do they want to survey it for? and they said they want to put a pipeline through here. And I looked around and I thought, a pipeline for what? Why would they want to put a pipeline for anything here? Well, what's in the pipeline? Well, they said it's gas. It's natural gas from Pennsylvania, from the shale beds in Pennsylvania, the Marcellus in particular, and it's going to be a very large pipe. It's going to be a 36-inch diameter natural gas, what they call a transmission pipeline. Well, I was just incredulous. We don't even use gas here. Why on earth would they be putting a pipeline like that through here? Well, I'm the kind of person, I'm very curious, so when I hear things like that, I started looking into it. And what I did was, along with some fellow residents, we formed a group here, and we called ourselves the Hilltown Community Rights. And the first thing we did is we did research, and we found out everything we could find about Kinder Morgan, about this pipeline, about what it meant, how they constructed, and all that. And I sent a letter to all of my local landowners, all of the people in this town that were going to be affected, and I said, please come and let's talk about this. I want to present what I've learned about this pipeline. And what I said to them was, you have a right to make any decision you want on your property. But what is important to me is that my neighbors and my community make good decisions based on good information. So that was the point, that was the purpose of having this talk. So we did that, and pretty much everybody came in the town. Whether they were for the pipeline or not, they came because they wanted to get the good information about this and not just rely on what the company Kinder Morgan was telling them. So we had that presentation, and was very well received, and people asked very good questions. And then in the ensuing months since that time, we've done quite a bit more information, more research. We found out things that the more we find out, the worse it looks. We found out things about Kinder Morgan, about how they operate as a company, which was very disturbing. They don't fund their pipeline maintenance like other companies do. They have behaviors in terms of how they treat the people in towns that they put their pipelines in. So as we started to realize that this was a company that was going to be very difficult to work with, because their whole behavior was not what one would want when negotiating leases and things like that. And again, part of our research told us that Kinder Morgan is actually Enron. The gentleman who was the CEO, who has now resigned, I might add, Richard Kinder, was the former COO of Enron. And he left Enron just before they collapsed, turned around and bought up all of their pipeline assets and then formed Kinder Morgan. So a lot of questions surrounding that whole situation. So, so this is what has been kind of going on up to this point. I am in a position here where the work we did as the Hilltown Community Rights transformed into work for a larger group called the Massachusetts Pipeline Awareness Network. And so now I'm working with that group as well as the Hilltown group to help educate landowners, work with lawyers, work with our representatives at the State House and in Congress to get them to understand what a pipeline like that means to a community like this. And what we're discovering is that this pipeline is going to be carrying so much gas. This pipeline alone carries about 2.2 billion cubic feet of gas through this area on its way to Drake, which is where there's what's called a terminus, where a bunch of pipelines come into it, one of which is a pipeline that goes up into Maine and then on to Canada. Now, that pipeline, the Portland pipeline, has just been permitted to reverse its flow to go north instead of south. What this tells us, and what we've learned, is that this gas coming through here is going for export. They want to be able to liquefy it in the Canadian facilities that liquefy natural gas, put it on ships and send it over to Europe to undercut the Asian market. They want to undercut Russia and China and sell this gas to Europe so that Russia doesn't have that market. So there's this whole big geopolitical play going on that's affecting us here in an area that has nothing at all to do with that. So it's important that we make that information available to people so they understand what this really means. Now, for me personally, it's a very personal issue. I have a piece of property here. It's about 36 acres. Again, it borders on a beautiful river. You can't see it, but there's a mountain right here outside the window that's got a beautiful view. And to have a pipeline coming through the property is going to bisect it, pretty much through the middle of it. And that pipeline is going to cut down a 100-foot wide swath of trees as it goes through the property. Now, from a visual standpoint, that's just horrific. To have that big cut of all that timber, much of it old growth, I might add, is really a huge loss. The other thing is that this land, the soil here is called Merrimack sandy loam. It's a glacial till type of soil that is deposited when the glaciers receded. This soil is very unstable, and we actually have power lines that go through the property right along the river. And if you look at a satellite photo, you can see there's a whole area where the soil has eroded down into the river. It's a very large, about 50 to 70 foot wide crater, like a ravine that's crashing down into the river. That's happening because they cut the trees along that power line right of way. And when you take trees out like that, you're going to destabilize the soil. If they put a pipeline through here, and my land is extremely hilly, it's got these very deep ravines, again, because the soil is so unstable, when water goes through land like that, it creates these ravines. So they're going to cut a 100-foot wide swath of trees, get rid of them. That's going to destabilize the soil. That pipeline is going to shift. And a shifting pipeline is a pipeline that fails. And a high pressure, and when I say high pressure, we're talking 1,400 pounds per square inch. It's very high pressure. When they fail catastrophically. And when a leak occurs, it self-ignites. This isn't something where you'll have a leak and it just goes into the atmosphere. No, they actually self-ignite because of the heat that's generated when the gas is escaping the pipe. That's going to start a forest fire and a conflagration here in all these woods. And depending on the conditions, that could be far worse than we think. So there's a real danger that these pipes pose to anyone living near them. And I have a neighbor up the street here where that pipeline is going to go within 50 feet of their house. And a pipeline that close, if it were to fail at that location, the blast alone would destroy their house and anyone in it. And so we don't have any setback laws. We don't have any setback regulations. It is unconscionable that anyone would put such a dangerous thing anywhere near property. But they do this because of what's called CBA, which stands for cost-benefit analysis. To companies like Kinder Morgan, we are a number. We have a value, our life has a value, and that value is expressed in terms of cost alone, not sympathy, not empathy, money. So for them, they look at how much it will cost them should an accident happen, and they factor that into their budget for laying this pipeline. Now, out here, that cost-benefit analysis tells them that they can use the thinnest wall pipe with the weakest joints. When you're in a denser population area, they have to use heavier pipe and joints that are bolted together. Not out here. They just weld it and throw it in the ground. And when you look at the accident reports, and there's a website called the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, it's part of the Department of Transportation, you'll see that the preponderance of pipeline failures are due to workmanship. 25% of pipeline failures are due to workmanship. You can see that data right on the website. Of those pipeline failures, the bulk of them are this type of pipeline, the thin wall welded pipe. So we look at these numbers and we think, well, we're just sitting ducks here because they are really doing the minimal that they need to do to put that pipeline in the ground and get the gas to where they want it to go, which is, again, the European market and not the market here. Now, when you add to that the other pipelines, it's not just the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which they call the Northeast Energy Direct, but we have these other pipelines that they want to put in Connecticut and New Hampshire and Vermont. And before you know it, there's not 2.2 billion cubic feet going up to Canada, but it's 6 billion cubic feet of gas going to Canada. Now, New England can't possibly use that much gas. So clearly, this gas is going to the European market. And we find that to be, we're now feeling like what somebody in Africa must feel like when a company comes into their country and builds a pipeline for oil and takes their oil and pays them nothing. And so we're getting a taste of our own medicine in that regard, where we as Americans, in order to have our energy security, take energy from other countries, and our government does that. Now we are the ones who are having our resources taken from us and sold to other countries for the benefit of that few 1% who own all of these companies. So these factors, when you start to put them together, paint a picture that is not pretty. And we as landowners who believe in the preservation of beautiful countryside like this, and we do so because we have facilities in this state to preserve them. And one of those facilities is called Title 97. I have a 36-acre property. 21 of those acres are in Title 97. That means that that land cannot be improved upon at all. I can walk on it. I can cut trails on it. I can manage the forest. I cannot build anything. Now, for a company to come in to build a pipeline on land where you are not allowed to build on it for the purpose of exporting gas to another country is just an incredibly egregious violation of our rights as landowners, our rights as preservationists, and our rights as citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to say nothing of this country. We demand, and we have used words like that our rights be heard, and that they cannot just come in here and ride roughshod over those rights. So we're working with our legislators. We're helping them write bills to protect Title 97 land and to get these companies to obey the regulations that are already in place, and not to just come in here and take things by eminent domain just because they want to do that. Now, there's a number of other factors here that we have also uncovered. One of which is the shale beds where they're getting this gas are these seams of what are called high carbon strata, where the methane is locked up, and they drill down and in sideways into those beds to fracture them and get the gas out. Now, the numbers that they've been talking about, and President Obama has been parroting those numbers, 100-year supply of gas from these shale beds. Well, I will tell you that the emails coming from the industry itself, from the geologists and the engineers who are actually working in the field to find these shale beds and to set up the wells to extract the gas, are saying to their bosses that there is not gas in these beds to the extent that we've been told. As a matter of fact, and this is now experience is telling us, with the existing wells that are out there right now, in an average well, the amount of gas that comes out of that well drops by over 60% within the first 2 years. That is a massive fall off in production. Now, in order to show that they still are producing gas, they have to put in more and more and more wells. Those wells cost an enormous amount of money, and they have to borrow that money. And what they're doing is that they're using the shale beds as collateral to borrow that money. Well, those shale beds are people's property. This is people like you and me who own those properties in Pennsylvania and in Texas and in Oklahoma that are having their properties basically used as collateral to borrow money to put these wells in. People are finding that when they want to go to the bank and borrow money because they want to build a house or do something on their property, the bank says, I'm sorry, a lien has been put on your property by this gas company. Well, the property owner never agreed to that. They never sanctioned that, but now they can't even borrow the money to do the things that they need to do. So these companies are having an economic impact more broadly than just simply putting a pipeline through someone's property or putting a well on somebody's property. So it's important that people start to look at these other aspects or these other impacts to them and their property from these types of projects, because they may find that down the road what they thought was just simply an easement is going to turn out to be something much greater. Another example I'll give you is homeowners insurance. For anyone who has a mortgage and they go to borrow money from a bank to buy a house, there's clauses in those mortgage agreements, and those clauses are very specific about hazardous material on the property. Oftentimes your mortgage is going to be bought by organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac from the banks that you took the mortgage out with originally. Those two organizations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, those mortgages have very specific clauses, and you can look this up, where they say if you have a hazardous material on your property, it nullifies the mortgage and they can call the mortgage on you. Now, if you're a homeowner and a company puts a pipeline through your property, you now have hazardous material on your property, because that pipeline is no different from a storage container full of natural gas. That's exactly what it is. So you can have the mortgage company come in and call that loan, and now you're going to lose your home. If you have homeowners insurance, look at your homeowner's policy. Again, you cannot have these things on your property. It is going to affect your insurance. So we implore people to talk to their insurance companies, talk to their mortgage company, and make sure that they understand what these implications are, because it's not going to be fun when they find out that when this pipeline goes through, that they're potentially going to lose their property on top of that. Now, I also have a message for people who use the gas. Now, these are people near us in the valley. There's gas lines in the valley that are using gas that are coming from those shale beds right now. About 60% of the gas that is used in this state comes from the Marcellus Shale. That gas is coming from shale beds that contain uranium. This is the whole geological process of a shale bed. They're full of carbon. Carbon is an excellent filter, as we all know. We all have them on our faucets to purify our water. When those shale beds are compressed and over time, they filter out heavy metals. Uranium is a heavy metal. The byproduct of uranium is radium and radon. We all know when you buy a house, you have to get it tested for radon. That's a very dangerous gas that can seep into your house from underground. Now, if you are in a home that uses natural gas, and that gas which is now coming from the Marcellus Shale, that gas is going to contain radon. And when you burn it in your home, like in your stove, for your cook stove and it's not properly vented, you're introducing radon into your home. And this is, again, something that it's extremely important that they understand that, because it would be foolhardy to introduce radioactive elements into the home, especially nowadays when code has homes being built that are much tighter, so the air change is very low compared to older homes. In New York, they are writing laws that govern the amount of radon in natural gas. And so these governments are well aware of this, and they know that there's radon in the gas, and they're writing laws to impose heavy fines on companies that are transporting that gas if the amount of radon exceeds 5 picocuries. That's a radiological term for the amount of radiation that's allowed. And this is an EPA standard of 5 picocuries. So we can see that governments are aware of this issue, and we can see that they see the need to do something about it, which is why that kind of legislation is being written. States like Connecticut and Ohio are banning the waste products from the well fracking process. When you drill a well into shale, you bring up what are called tailings. So these are the pieces of shale that come up from the drilling process. Those tailings have to be dealt with. They have to be disposed of somewhere. And states are saying, no, you cannot dispose of them here because those tailings are full of uranium, they're radioactive, and we don't want them. So the very process of fracking is bringing up all this intense radiological material and forcing us to accept the burial of it in wherever. I mean, it's got to go somewhere. And so we're forced, if we don't pass laws, to have that material put in our landfills and contaminate our groundwater. So there's a very serious a poisoning aspect to this gas. But when you look at just in laying a pipe, when you look at the process of digging a trench and putting a pipe in it, you're cutting through rivers and streams. And when you look at a map of western Massachusetts, for example, you'll see there are many, many small tributaries. It's an amazing environment that has an amazing number of small wetlands, tributaries, watersheds, and headwaters. All of those are going to be affected when you cut a trench that bisects all of them. There's a geological process that occurs where you're connecting all that water underground, and that's never a good thing. So again, these big industrial projects, they have impacts that go far beyond the act of actually installing the pipe. But I want to talk about, just from a personal note, getting back to me living on this land here. I have a barn, and on that barn I installed solar panels. I'm one of these people that feel that I have a right and a responsibility to use energy wisely. What energy I use, I want to use it wisely. So I felt it was important that I produce my own electricity so that I could control how that electricity is produced. So I purchased solar panels and put them on their barn. I got them as many as I'm allowed as a residential homeowner, which is about 10 kilowatts worth of solar panels. So I don't have a need for electricity. As a matter of fact, I produce more electricity than I actually consume myself. So I give the excess to, there's a store in town called Elmer's, and I support the local store, so I give them some of my excess energy that I'm not using. When I bought the house, it used not natural gas, but liquefied petroleum gas, or LP. And there's a tank in the yard there where they fill it. And that's used to heat the home. It's used for my stove and whatnot. I said, I don't think that's what I want to be using. So what I did is I purchased what's called a pellet boiler. that I use to heat the home. And that boiler uses these small compressed wood pellets, or I can take regular wood and put it in there and burn it just like a wood boiler. So now I can heat my home with the amount of wood that I have on the property. So in that regard, I'm self-sufficient. So in terms of the larger picture, I'm pretty much a zero net home. I produce the energy that I need right here. I'm not reliant on the oil companies. I'm not reliant on power plants. As a matter of fact, I reduce the need for power because I produce more power than I actually use. And that brings me to another issue that I'm very passionate about. And that is solar energy itself, and in particular, solar photovoltaic energy production. We're seeing more and more now reports coming out, especially in economic journals, where the number of solar panels being installed on houses is having an impact on the grid. This means that the more people use solar, the fewer people are actually using electricity that's being generated by power plants. Now, in order to maintain the grid, that costs money. And that money is spread out over all the customers who buy power. Well, people who are installing solar panels, they're not buying that power. So the people who are left on the grid, who are still buying power on the grid, have to shoulder the greater burden of the maintenance of the grid. Now, this is going to have an impact. As more and more people buy solar and buy less grid energy, it's going to exacerbate that problem. Now, along come batteries. Right now, we have what are called grid tie systems. That's what I have. My panels, when the sun is out, they generate electricity that goes onto the grid and it goes through a meter. And then the electricity I use comes from the grid and goes through a meter. And then it gets credited. So on my bill, if I use X and I produce Y and Y is greater than X, I'm going to have a credit. So as battery technology is coming out now and the costs for batteries are getting less, people with solar panels like myself are going to start buying batteries and cutting that grid tie completely. As that happens, more and more people are going to choose batteries and getting off the grid altogether because it's going to be more cost effective for them to do so instead of staying on the grid. This will eventually go into a death spiral where people will have no choice but to get off the grid in order to produce their power at a cost that makes any sense. Otherwise, the grid energy is going to be way too expensive. So we have a transition, a shift here that's happening in this country, particularly here in New England, where the numbers say that in 4 years, the cost of solar panels and batteries will equal what you pay for power on the grid. When that happens, when we get past that point, it's going to change everything. And the way we deliver energy in New England and in this country is going to change. The fossil fuel industry is going to go away. It has no choice. It cannot continue to operate because solar panels are going to completely replace the energy that's used for heating, lighting, and transportation. Now, how long will that take? I don't have that number, but I can tell you that it's going to accelerate. And when it begins accelerating, that change will start impacting everyone. So we have a very exciting time here, but we have to be very vigilant that we not allow these kinds of pipeline projects at a time when solar is flourishing and we could be embracing that this new era and creating jobs. When you invest $1 million in the solar-related industry, and when I say solar-related, that would include solar photovoltaic, wind, efficiencies, building retrofits, and things like that. When you invest $1 million in the fossil fuel industry, you get about 1.2, 1.7 jobs for every $1 million invested. In the solar-related industry, for every $1 million invested, you get 7 jobs. This is a massive difference. When they talk about creating jobs for things like these pipelines, it's nothing compared to the jobs that are created for solar. And this is what we need people to understand, that solar creates jobs. People need jobs in this country. 1 out of 7 households are on food stamps. This is America. How can that be when we have been driving technology? We've been driving the business sector. We've been driving the energy sector. This isn't what we do. This is not what we're about. We're about creating good jobs with good technology that's applied reasonably. Solar is that technology. We're at the end of the fossil fuel era. And these pipelines are simply the last vestige of a business mindset that is trying to eke out the last bit of profit before it goes away. And they know it's going away. We all know it's going away. So we have to just be very vigilant to say, look, I'm sorry, this gas isn't for us. You can't do this. And many people now are saying that. As a matter of fact, there's a great quote, and unfortunately I can't attribute it to the CEO who said it, but it was a quote by Bill McKibben at the Climate March in New York. And the quote went something to the effect of, we will never be able to build another pipeline in peace again. And for someone in the fossil fuel industry to say that is very telling. And the truth is, they can't. Nobody is going to allow this anymore. People are done having their lands and their homes and their lives destroyed by these old archaic infrastructures. That time is over. So here, with this particular project, our message to Kinder Morgan is, I'm sorry, we're not going to allow you to make your last bit of pennies on our backs and on the backs of other people along this pipeline route. It's just not going to happen. So I want to thank everyone who has done the work to raise their voice, to help their neighbors understand the reality of what this means, and to put an end to what really is something that should have stopped a while ago. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing all that wonderful information with us. A lot of it was new to me, and I'm getting to know quite a bit, so it was very helpful. And thank you very much, and it's wonderful being in this beautiful spot, and we're all hoping that nothing will change here for you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.